They were told the British saw Germans as a monolithic enemy, that nationality defined everything, that family names meant nothing beyond identifying prisoners. But when 43 German women arrived at a processing camp in Sussex in July 1945, a British sergeant reading names from a roster shattered their understanding of the world, not with hostility, but with something that made no sense at all. A young German clerk named Schmidt stood trembling as her name was called for assignment. The British sergeant looked up from his clipboard, looked at her and said quietly, "Schmidt, my name's Schmidt too. My grandfather came from Bavaria." He didn't mock, he didn't dismiss. He acknowledged shared heritage as though bloodlines could transcend battle lines, as though family names could bridge what war had torn apart. They expected to be numbers. They became relatives, and in that moment, everything they had been taught about British hatred began to fracture. If this story moves you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true accounts from World War II. These histories deserve to be remembered. The summer heat hung heavy over southern England in July 1945. News of Germany's unconditional surrender had spread through prisoner camps and military installations like wildfire, discussed in hushed German and barked English orders. For British authorities managing tens of thousands of German POWs, it meant the enormous task of processing, housing, and organising former enemies. For the German women captured serving the Wehrmacht as clerks, radio operators, medical auxiliaries, and support staff, it meant terror, uncertainty, and the horrifying prospect of British vengeance. In camps across England, German women who had served in occupied territories found themselves prisoners in a foreign land whose people they'd been taught to fear. The Reich that had deployed them had collapsed. The officers who had commanded them were dead, fled, or imprisoned themselves. Now they stood in small groups, exhausted, isolated, waiting to learn their fate from guards whose names they couldn't pronounce and whose motivations they couldn't understand. Among them was Frieda Schmidt, 27 years old, a records clerk from Munich, who had been stationed in Belgium until the Allied advance overran her position. She stood with her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself invisible among the crowd. Next to her was Helga Bauer, a former signals operator who had worked at Wehrmacht communications posts from Norway to France. Helga's hands shook constantly now, a tremor she couldn't control, legacy of too many near misses and too much fear. There was also Maria Richter, barely 22, who had been pulled from secretarial school in Hamburg and assigned to military administration. She stood with her eyes fixed downward, silent. The other women had learned not to ask about her fiancé. He had died at Stalingrad. The British soldiers who managed them were brisk and businesslike. There was no violence, but there was no warmth either. They lined the women up, checked names against typed lists, counted them, processed them like cargo. The women kept their heads down, trying to understand English commands, terrified of making mistakes that might bring punishment. "Right. Listen up," a British officer said, speaking slowly but making no effort at translation. "You're being assigned to work details, light industry, agriculture, support services. You'll be housed in converted facilities. You'll earn tokens for the canteen. You'll follow regulations. Clear?" The women nodded, understanding perhaps one word in four. Work, they understood. Regulations, they could guess at. What treatment actually meant remained terrifyingly unknown. That afternoon, they were loaded onto trucks, clutching their meagre possessions. The canvas-covered vehicles drove through countryside that looked surreal in its normalcy. Fields were cultivated. Villages stood intact. People went about their lives. The contrast with the shattered Germany they remembered was incomprehensible. "How is this possible?" Frieda whispered in German. "How can they look untouched?" Maria stared through gaps in the canvas, her mind trying to reconcile this with the Hamburg ruins she'd heard described. Clean streets, functioning infrastructure, children playing. She thought of her fiancé dying in frozen mud while these people lived in peace. The trucks finally stopped at a processing camp on the Sussex coast. As the women climbed down, they looked around cautiously. The camp was large, organised, consisting of rows of Nissen huts surrounded by wire fencing. Guard towers stood at intervals. British military personnel moved about their duties with calm efficiency. It looked institutional, impersonal, but not immediately threatening. They were directed into a large administrative building for final processing. Inside, British soldiers sat at desks with stacks of paperwork, typewriters, file folders. It looked like any military bureaucracy, except these were the victors processing the vanquished. The women were lined up alphabetically. Names would be called, assignments given, identification papers issued. It was mundane, routine. And then something remarkable began to happen. The first woman was called forward, Helga Bauer. A British corporal at the desk looked up as she approached. "Bauer," he said, his pronunciation decent. He looked at her, then said in broken German, "Mein Name ist auch Bauer. Mein Großvater kam aus Deutschland." My name is also Bauer. My grandfather came from Germany. Helga froze. She stared at the British soldier, unable to process what she'd just heard. A British corporal, named Bauer, with German ancestry, speaking German. The corporal saw her shock and smiled slightly. "My family came to England in 1890, but the name stayed. We're probably distant cousins, you and I." He stamped her papers and handed them over. "Welcome to Camp Sussex, Frau Bauer. Hope your stay is, well, as comfortable as circumstances allow." Helga took her papers with trembling hands and moved on, her mind reeling. The other women had watched this interaction with confusion. What had just happened? More names were called. Frieda Schmidt. Frieda approached a different desk. The British sergeant looked at her papers, then up at her face. "Schmidt," he said. He paused, then added, "That's my name as well. Sergeant Michael Schmidt. My grandfather emigrated from Bavaria in 1905. Frieda felt the world tilt. "But you're British," she said in halting English. "I'm British now," Schmidt replied in accented German. "But I'm German by blood. My father spoke German at home. I spoke it as a child. War makes enemies of cousins, doesn't it?" He processed her papers efficiently. "You'll be assigned to clerical work. Your English will improve. You'll be fine." As Frieda moved away, she heard more names being called. "Maria Richter." The British private at that desk looked up. "Richter? My mum was a Richter before she married. Her parents came from Saxony." Another woman, called forward, "Elizabeth Weber." The corporal. "Weber's my middle name, family name on my mother's side. They came from near Frankfurt." Again and again, the pattern repeated. Not every British soldier had German heritage, but enough did that the coincidences became impossible to ignore. The German women began whispering to each other, their voices rising with disbelief and confusion. "This can't be real," someone muttered. "This is impossible," another said. "How can our enemies have our names?" A British lieutenant noticed the growing agitation and called for attention. Through a translator, he explained, "Many of you share surnames with British citizens. This is because England received large waves of German immigration in the 1800s and early 1900s. Hundreds of thousands of Germans came here, settled, married into British families, had children. Many of their descendants are now British soldiers. Some of you may well be distant relatives of the guards here. War is complicated that way," the translator finished. Silence filled the room. The German women stared at the British soldiers, seeing them differently now. Not just as enemies, but as people who might share bloodlines, family trees that branched across borders and battlefields. That evening, assigned to their Nissen huts, the women couldn't stop talking about what had happened. "A British soldier named Schmidt told me we might be cousins," Frieda said, her voice hollow. "How am I supposed to hate someone named Schmidt? That's my father's name, my grandfather's name." Helga added, "The one who processed me, Corporal Bauer, said his grandfather came from the same region my family is from. We could actually be related. Distant, but related. But they're the enemy, Maria protested, though her voice lacked conviction. They defeated us. They're holding us prisoner. Yes, Frieda replied slowly, but they're also Schmidts and Bauers and Webers and Richters. How do you wage war against your own family names? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Over the following days, the pattern continued. The women worked in camp facilities, laundry, kitchen, clerical offices, light assembly work. They interacted daily with British personnel, and increasingly, they discovered connections. A German woman named Fisher worked under a British sergeant named Fisher, anglicised spelling, but clearly the same name, same German origin. A woman named Schneider discovered the British quartermaster was named Taylor, the English translation of Schneider, both meaning tailor, his great-grandparents having anglicised the name during World War I. A woman named Zimmerman found herself working alongside a British corporal named Carpenter, again, anglicised translation of the German name. The connections were everywhere. During a work break, Frieda found herself talking to Sergeant Schmidt, both assigned to the camp administrative office. He spoke enough German to communicate, and she was learning English quickly. "This must be strange for you," Schmidt said in German, "finding out your captors share your names." "More than strange," Frieda replied. "It's disorienting. We were taught you hated us, that you saw Germans as inferior, as monsters." "Some do hate you," Schmidt said honestly. "They've lost friends, family. They've seen what was done in Germany's name. That hatred is real." "Then why don't you hate me?" Schmidt considered this. "Because my father taught me that Germans aren't a monolith. He remembered his German childhood, his German family. He taught me German songs, German stories. He made me understand that nationality is complicated, that people are people regardless of passports." He paused. "Besides, you're a clerk. You filed papers. That doesn't make you responsible for concentration camps or invasions. War needs clerks, but clerks don't make war." Frieda felt tears prick her eyes. "I didn't know about the camps. Not really. We heard rumours, but—" "I believe you," Schmidt said. "Most didn't know. Most were just trying to survive, to do their jobs, to get through each day. That's what most people do in war." As weeks passed, the German women settled into routine. The work was tedious, but not harsh. The food was basic, but adequate. The guards were professional, neither cruel nor especially kind, simply doing their jobs. But the discovery of shared surnames had cracked something open. The German women began to see their captors as individuals with histories, with German ancestry, with family connections that crossed enemy lines. Helga Bauer found herself working in the camp hospital alongside a British nurse named Bauer. They weren't related, or probably weren't, but the shared name created an immediate strange connection. The British nurse, Eleanor Bauer, explained that her grandfather had been a doctor in Hamburg before emigrating. He wanted a better life, he found it here, but he never stopped being German in his heart. He passed that to my father, who passed some of it to me. "Do you speak German?" Helga asked. "A little. My father taught me some before he died. I've forgotten most of it." Eleanor paused. "But I remember the songs. He used to sing German lullabies." She sang a few lines of "Guten Abend, gute Nacht." Helga recognized it immediately. "My mother sang that to me," she said, her voice breaking. "It's the same song." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "Because we're not really different, are we? Just born on different sides of an arbitrary line, raised with different flags. But underneath, we share grandmothers who sang the same songs." The conversation haunted Helga. She had spent years seeing the British as the enemy, as fundamentally different. But Eleanor Bauer proved that difference was more complicated than she'd been taught. 3 months into their captivity, in October 1945, something crystallized the transformation. The camp was organizing a memorial service for all soldiers who had died in the war. British, German, Allied, Axis, everyone. It was controversial. Many British soldiers objected to honouring German dead. Many German prisoners felt uncomfortable participating, but Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the camp commander, insisted. Through a translator, he explained his reasoning. War is over. Now we honour the dead, all the dead, because they were sons and brothers and fathers, regardless of which uniform they wore. Some of you share surnames with them. British soldiers with German names who died fighting Wehrmacht soldiers with German names. The absurdity should be obvious. The service was held in the camp's open assembly area. British soldiers stood on one side, German prisoners on the other. A chaplain spoke in English. A German pastor, himself a prisoner, spoke in German. Names were read. British casualties with German surnames. German casualties that matched British surnames. Schmidt, Bauer, Müller, Fischer, Wagner. The same names, repeated on both sides, connecting the dead across enemy lines. As the names were read, something broke among both groups. British soldiers saw their own surnames on the German casualty list. German prisoners heard their names among British dead. The absurdity, the tragedy, the profound waste became undeniable. Frieda Schmidt stood listening as both British and German Schmidts were named among the fallen. She thought about family trees that branched into England and stayed in Germany, about cousins who might have killed each other without knowing they were related. Tears streamed down her face. Around her, other German women cried. Across the divide, some British soldiers cried too. After the service, Sergeant Schmidt approached Frieda. His own eyes were red. "My cousin died in France," he said in German. "Fighting against Germans, maybe against your unit, I'll never know." "I'm sorry," Frieda said. "We all are," Schmidt replied. "That's the point. We're all sorry, because we're all connected by names, by heritage, by shared humanity. War tried to make us forget that. But names remember. Family remembers." That evening, the German women gathered in their hut, processing what had happened. The shared memorial, the recognition of shared names among the dead, the acknowledgement of connection despite enmity, it had shattered remaining certainties. "We were taught they were completely different from us," Maria said quietly. "That they were weak, decadent, fundamentally other. But they have our names. Their ancestors were our ancestors. Some of them are literally our cousins, separated by a generation or two and an ocean." "What does that mean for everything we believed?" another woman asked. Helga answered, her voice steady. "It means we were lied to. It means nationality is more complicated than propaganda allows. It means family trees don't respect battle lines. It means we share more with our enemies than we were taught to believe." "But we still lost," someone said bitterly. "We're still prisoners." "Yes," Helga replied, "but we're prisoners who've discovered that our guards might be our relatives." That changes what defeat means. That complicates hatred. That makes reconstruction more possible. The months passed. Winter came. The German women continued their work, continued their interactions with British personnel who shared their surnames. Slowly, painfully, a new understanding emerged. They were still prisoners. They still missed home desperately. But they were no longer simply enemies. They were complicated. Prisoners and relatives, defeated and connected. Different and similar. In early 1946, Frieda was called to the administrative office. Sergeant Schmidt wanted to speak with her. She arrived nervously, uncertain what this meant. Schmidt gestured for her to sit. "I've been doing some research," he said in German. "My family came from a village near Munich. You said your family is from Munich." "Yes, a small village outside the city." "What village?" "Grunwald." Schmidt's eyes widened. "My grandfather's family was from Grunwald. He left in 1905. Do you know any Schmidt families there?" "There were several. It's a common name, but there was one family, my mother mentioned them. They had a son who emigrated to England before the First War." Schmidt pulled out a photograph, old and faded. Is this the church in Grunwald? Frieda looked at it. Her breath caught. Yes, that's St. Peter's. I was baptized there. Schmidt was quiet for a long moment. So was my grandfather. We might actually be related. Distantly, but related. The realization hung between them. They weren't just two people who shared a common German surname. They might be actual family, separated by emigration and reunited by war. What do we do with this? Frieda asked. We remember it, Schmidt said. We let it change us. We tell people that enemies can be family, that war makes no sense when you discover you're fighting your own relatives. He paused. And when you go home to Germany, when you rebuild, you remember that the British aren't just enemies. Some of us are literally your family. Frieda nodded, overwhelmed. In spring 1946, the German women learned they would be repatriated. The news brought relief, fear, grief. Relief at going home, fear of what they'd find, grief at leaving connections they'd formed. On their last day, a farewell gathering was organised. British personnel who had worked with the German prisoners came to say goodbye. Sergeant Schmidt found Frieda. I wrote down my address, he said, handing her a piece of paper. If you make it back to Grunwald, if you find any Schmidt family there, tell them Michael Schmidt in England remembers them. Tell them family matters more than flags. Frieda took the paper, tears streaming. I will, and thank you, for showing me that enemies can be relatives, for proving that shared names mean something. Corporal Bauer found Helga. Safe journey home. I hope you find your family well. And remember, some of your enemies shared your name. Let that mean something when you rebuild. The German women boarded trucks, carrying small bundles and enormous realizations. As they drove away, British soldiers waved. Some called out surnames. Goodbye, Frau Schmidt. Safe travels, Frau Bauer. Acknowledging connection even in farewell. Decades passed. The German women scattered across divided Germany, rebuilding lives in the ruins. Some never spoke of their time in England, unable to articulate what the discovery of shared surnames had meant. Others told carefully edited versions. Frieda returned to Grunwald. She found the Schmidt families that remained, told them about Michael Schmidt in England, who shared their name and their baptismal church. She maintained correspondence with him for years, two people connected by surname and separated by war, choosing connection over enmity. Maria became a genealogist, helping Germans trace family trees that often revealed relatives who had emigrated to England, America, elsewhere. She specialized in reconnecting families separated by emigration and war. Helga worked in refugee services, helping displaced persons navigate divided Germany. She never forgot that enemies could share surnames, that connection could exist despite conflict. In 1985, 40 years after the war, several of the former prisoners organized a reunion. 8 managed to attend, elderly women now, gathering in Munich. They shared memories, compared notes on what their lives had become, and talked about the experience that had defined them. Do you remember when we discovered the British Guards had our names? Someone asked. Everyone nodded. Of course they remembered. It was the moment everything changed, Frieda said. We couldn't hate people who shared our surnames. We couldn't see them as completely other when they were possibly our relatives. Names connected us across enemy lines. Maria added, I've thought about that for 40 years, about how surnames revealed that enemies weren't as different as propaganda claimed, about how family names cross borders that politics creates, about how war makes enemies of relatives who might not even know they're related. She paused. I think that's what I want people to understand, that nationality is recent and temporary, but family is old and enduring. That many of us have relatives in enemy countries, separated by emigration, connected by blood. That war makes us forget these connections, but names remember. The women sat in silence, reflecting on this truth. Years later, Frieda's granddaughter found among her grandmother's papers a letter from 1946, written shortly after returning to Germany. I expected my captors to be monsters. Instead, I found people named Schmidt and Bauer and Richter, my own names, family names that crossed the English Channel decades ago and returned as guard names on my prison roster. The British didn't defeat us with cruelty. They defeated our hatred with genealogy, our propaganda with surnames, our certainty with the uncomfortable recognition that enemies can share family names. In that Sussex camp, I learned that family trees branch across borders, that emigration creates relatives in enemy nations, and that shared surnames connect us in ways war tries to sever. I could never return to the simple hatred I'd been taught. The story of Frieda Schmidt and the German POWs who discovered their British guards shared their surnames is not widely known. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of Allied victory or enemy defeat. But it's a story worth remembering because it reminds us that in the midst of history's greatest conflicts, family connections survive across enemy lines. Sometimes the most powerful revelation is discovering your enemy shares your name. Sometimes genealogy defeats propaganda more effectively than any weapon. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept, and the most transformative, is that family trees don't respect battle lines, that emigration creates relatives in enemy nations, and that we might be fighting distant cousins without even knowing it. War makes enemies of nations, but surnames remember that families crossed those borders long before armies did. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are thousands of untold stories from World War II. Human stories that complicate our understanding of nationality and family, of enemies and relatives, of what it means to discover connection in the midst of conflict. These stories deserve to be remembered and shared. Thank you for watching.